Hi, I'm Scoot. It is August the 15th, and it was exactly 50 years ago today that the iconic, epic concert, Woodstock, began in upstate New York. This is the Daily Hit on Scoot on the Air YouTube. It's also on the scootontheair.com website. And check out our website. It's SOTA, scootontheair.com, every day because we've always got new stuff for you. And we will continue to make this a source of information for our show. And the radio show is on WWL, AM/FM, and .com. And if you do not have this yet, download the radio app, radio.com. And then just type in WWL. And the show's there. It's on 1 to 4 in the afternoon, New Orleans time. And also, you can subscribe to us on the Scoot on the Air YouTube channel by just going to Scoot on the Air on YouTube and become a subscriber. Doesn't cost anything, and we'll let you know when we have something new coming up. Today is a very, very significant day for baby boomers. Now, baby boomers used to be this young, unhinged, rebellious, anti-establishment generation. And 50 years ago today, Woodstock began in upstate New York. It was actually in Bethel, New York, which is about 40 miles away from Woodstock, which is the original location. But look, this was a logistical nightmare for promoters. This concert became more than just a concert. When word spread that this festival was going on, it spread like gospel through a young generation. And they were anticipating about 50,000 people. The crowd estimate is somewhere between 400 and 500,000. And people came from all over. Roads were blocked. There were 2-lane highways leading into the festival area. There were delays in getting people to the festival. At one point, it was $6 a day was the admission price. But at one point, so many people were coming and people were climbing over the fence and knocking down fences that promoters finally just said, okay, it's a free concert. And they let everybody in. There was so much traffic that the first band, Sweetwater, was not able to take the stage. Folk singer Richie Havens was there, and they asked him to go on first. And he did. And his set went on for about 3 hours. He'd gone through his entire set list and started doing covers of songs like a Beatles song, Strawberry Fields Forever. He had to stay on long enough to get other people there. And so the promoters finally chartered a U.S. Army helicopter that flew some musicians into the venue. And so then Richie Havens was able to leave the stage, and it was continuing from that point. The bands that were there, Janis Joplin, Santana, The Who, Canned Heat. God, the list goes on so long. Creedence Clearwater Revival was one of the main bands there. And Jimi Hendrix, of course, was there. Jimi Hendrix had in his contract, and he had a very strict contract, had in his contract that no artist or band could perform after him. He was to be the last act. But with rain delays, Woodstock was supposed to end on a Sunday. Jimi Hendrix did not go on stage until 9 a.m. Monday morning. A lot of people left. The concert was supposed to be over Sunday. A lot of people left. And so not everybody saw Jimi Hendrix. Starting at 9 a.m. on that Monday morning, he did his classic hits, Foxy Lady, his version of the Star Spangled Banner. His encore was Hey Joe, a classic Jimi Hendrix song. Jimi Hendrix was also paid in advance of performing the equivalent of what would be $200,000 today, which was a lot of money back then. It's a lot of money today, but certainly a lot of money back then. So, this was a concert that really did, in a lot of ways, define a young generation. Now, for New Orleans and the Gulf Coast region, there was this storm that was passing Cuba heading into the Gulf of Mexico. The storm name was Camille. Camille turned out to be one of the worst hurricanes ever to hit the United States. And it centered on Gulfport, Biloxi, the Mississippi Gulf Coast. There were effects in New Orleans, in fact, effects to the east of the Gulf Coast, but the Gulf Coast was hit in a devastating way. And the Gulf Coast really did an incredible job of coming back after Camille. But even a young generation was caught up in the anticipation of Hurricane Camille. And then, of course, in the aftermath. But it didn't take long for that young generation to pay attention to what was being said about this phenomenon that took place in upstate New York. And it became a reflection of that generation. That doesn't mean that you agreed with everything that that generation stood for. But as a generation, this was a generation that, and think about this, Woodstock took place in 1969. That was the year after one of the most turbulent years in American history. In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Democratic presidential frontrunner, Senator Bobby Kennedy, was assassinated. There were riots and violence at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968. 1968 was a rough year, and it was a tough year for the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War had really grown to be unpopular at this point, and there were a lot of protests. It's almost as if, collectively as a generation, Woodstock seemed to be an attempt to put that turbulent year of 69 behind us. And it was about peace and love. In fact, it was billed as 3 days of peace and love. And for the most part, that's what it was. 400,000 to 500,000 people. There were 3 deaths. 2 people died of drug overdoses, and one 17-year-old was killed. He was sleeping in his sleeping bag when a tractor rolled over him. The tractor was collecting trash and debris from the festival site. There were rumors of births, but there are no confirmed births at Woodstock, and there were 8 miscarriages. Now, I know some people will go, oh my God, 8 miscarriages, that's horrible. Well, we're talking about 400,000 to 500,000 young people. I don't know what the percentage is of people that have miscarriages, but it's not that unusual. Here we had young people. Many of them might not have even known they were pregnant at the time. And so I don't know that 8 miscarriages is that significant. But interestingly, the myth is not true. There were no confirmed births at Woodstock. There was making love. There was mud. There was, open sexuality. This was the freedom of a young generation. What's interesting is that young, unhinged generation then, 50 years later, has become the establishment. And I think there's a lot of reconciliation for my generation, the baby boomers. 50 years ago at Woodstock, and even if you weren't at Woodstock, if you related to the movement of Woodstock and what it meant to a young generation, what did we stand for? We stood for equality. We rebelled against the establishment's judgment of people based on race, religion, gender, sexual orientation. We were the inclusive generation. 50 years later, we're not that generation anymore. Because in many ways, baby boomers have fueled the judgment based on race, religion, gender, and sexual orientation. So for many baby boomers, if you're honest, there's some reconciliation that needs to be done from then and who you are now. But the one interesting thing that did not change, the one endearing aspect of Woodstock, is that generation, the establishment at the time, thought rock was a passing phase. Well, it wasn't. Because here, 50 years later, baby boomers are still rocking it. And Mick Jagger and the Stones and Paul McCartney and Steven Tyler, Aerosmith, and Rod Stewart, and so many groups from the past, John Fogerty still performing, so many groups from the past are still performing today. And 50 years later, in their 70s, they still look great, they're still having fun, and baby boomers are still going to concerts. So the one real endearing aspect, I think, of Woodstock was the idea that that generation never lost the rock in its soul. 50 years ago today was the anniversary of Woodstock. Happened 50 years ago. And today, a generation should look back and see Woodstock as a milepost on their journey through life. And maybe there's some things that we could learn about the generation we used to be compared to the generation that we have become. I'm proud of my generation in many ways, but there are times that I refer to myself as a hostile witness to the baby boomer generation. And we have always been an egotistical generation. Sometimes I think we fail to recognize our faults and our greed. And there are millennials and Gen X and Gen Y, other generations are bitter and they're angry at us because of our greed, because of the world that we're going to leave them. And we should accept responsibility for that. But let's just think back on the peace and love that occurred 50 years ago today as part of Woodstock.